Hello, welcome to Windmill Wisdom. I'm Monty Edwards with M. Edwards Realtors, and I'm here today as your host. I want to welcome these guys at the table with us today for our inaugural episode of Windmill Wisdom. This show is primarily gauged to help landowners and farmers that are producers in the area to gather information about different topics. Today our main topic is going to be farm leases, and we're going to have these guys kind of drill down into the meat of that subject. But before we get started, I'd like to go around the table and allow each one of them to kind of introduce themselves. Seth?
Hi, I'm Seth Sowder. I'm a general lines property and casualty agent for Lance Insurance Agency here in Sudan. I also farm a 1,500-acre operation, cotton and grain sorghum, southern part of Lamb County and southeastern part of Bailey County. I live here in Sudan with my wife Megan and my daughters Maddie, Jo, and Sterling.
Cary?
I'm Cary Hanlin. I'm the County Executive Director for the Farm Service Agency here in Lamb County. I've been with the agency for approximately 20 years in multiple counties. I'm married to my wife Cary, and we have 3 kids, Carson, Cambry, and Kennedy.
My name is Jarrod Busby. I'm a practicing attorney here in Lamb County, Lubbock County, and the surrounding areas. Main area of practice is estate planning, probate. I do wills, trusts, real estate transactions. So generally in office practice. I live north of Olton in Lamb County with my wife, Jennifer, and 3 kids, Bella, Bonnie, and Jude. And also involved actively in my family's farming, corn production for silage usually, and cattle operation.
I was going to go around and make you guys all have to tell the birthdays on all your kids, but I won't do that. No, I was just kidding. Well, I appreciate y'all being here. Before we get started, we would like to put out a special thanks to Shelby's Bridge for letting us use their location to shoot Windmill Wisdom. Shelby's Bridge is a 501c3 that is set up with a special focus on helping families and children with special needs and enriching their lives. If you don't know about Shelby's Bridge, I would encourage you to check out their Facebook page or website. We will have some information posted about it. But they have a gift and thrift shop here in Sudan and a cafe. And they're doing some really big things and have some big plans to help impact the lives of folks with disabilities and special needs in West Texas. So thank them again for allowing us to use this venue. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started today. I'd like to thank you guys for being here for our inaugural voyage. And we're just going to go ahead with Seth. Seth, I'm going to let you kind of go around and just tell us a little bit more detail about what you're going to be talking today about around farm and ranch leases. We'll go around the table. Then we'll get started kind of getting deeper into the topics.
Sounds great. Well, thanks for having me, Monty. My aspect's going to be looking at it, maybe a little from a personal aspect as a producer in a row crop kind of situation, cash rent, cash lease, and also from a risk management standpoint, and the crop insurance, kind of the differences we see there. Again, probably more so on the row crop side. So.
Monty, thanks again for having me. Basically, what I'm going to be visiting about is how cash leases and shared leases interact with our programs, and kind of some of the rules and how they go hand in hand, with the outside cash leases and the FSA leases.
Thanks for the opportunity, Monty. And I'll try not to overlap too much with what Seth talks about as far as the crop share and cash lease situations, kind of some options, pros and cons about the 2 types of leases, and then some of the common pitfalls, some of the mistakes people make in either signing a lease or not signing a lease, just oral leases. So anyway, that's kind of a general description.
All right. Well, I think this is a topic that I know in my business, being in the farm and ranch real estate business, that we hear about a lot. A lot of times, unfortunately, it's not always under the best circumstances when people start wondering what their lease says or if they have a lease or anything like that. So I think it's going to be an interesting topic today, and I hope that the folks that are out there, if you have any questions as this comes in, you can send them in to our email address, and we'll put that up on the screen for you. But we will try to, field topics on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and let's let you start, Seth.
Well, here we go.
Kind of put you on the spot there.
Yes, sir. Well, me personally in my operation, I have a little bit of both. I have the opportunity to have cash lease. That's more of a fixed cost on the front end kind of thing. It's something that I've come to just build into my early year plan. On the other side, we've got a different share arrangements, on the cash rent side. I think it's a good, if you have the ability to do it, to actually have a mix of both. If you're talking about your own operation, that may not go well with all landlords because, like I said, like Jarrod said, there's pros and cons to those as well. I think unique-wise from a crop insurance standpoint, I've got some landlords, who are, they are on a rent basis, but they may have an operating note, and so we get to look at that uniquely, on their own, perspectives, some of the risks that they have based on their arrangement. And so it's kind of, it's a little bit different than handling a producer, but in a lot of ways, there's some similarities with it too. So,
well, I know one of the interesting things that comes up for me, because I worked as Seth and I was in the crop insurance business for a while too, is a timing factor sometimes on when you make these agreements. With talking about landlords, sometimes is there some critical dates there that landowners need to be aware of if they make a change on the farm?
Absolutely. It's really good if you're leaving a cash lease kind of situation, you're going to go to a share rent. The first date you need to be aware of is March 15th, sales closing date for this part of the world. That's going to vary a little bit across the state as you move east and you move south, but primarily for this region, that's a deadline. You want to have your crop insurance selection in, your application signed, so that you can start taking care of your percentage.
Because if you're on a cash lease, actually what you haven't been having to carry crop insurance.
Absolutely.
Okay, I got you. Cary, is that something that they have to watch for at the FSA office?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And being out here in West Texas, 97 to 98% of the leases that we have are all share lease. We don't see typically a whole lot of cash leases unless it's for some corn ground or some cattle operations and stuff like that. So the majority of the leases that I work with and see in my office are share leases. And typically, we don't see those leases on the backside when those guys come in and sign their CCC 861, which is the ARC PLC contract. That's the lease agreement that we see. And typically those things are, share rent 25, 75% to the owner and to the operator 75. And we just make sure that those are commensurate. However they sign up the ARC PLC contract is what we make sure they certify on the 578. So that's typically more what we see as far as shared leases go.
And I suspect here in a little bit when Jarrod opens up what he's going to talk about a little bit, I think folks sometimes don't realize that they probably need something more than just what y'all require.
Right.
Right. So, Seth, one other thing, touching on the crop insurance aspect of it, as far as when you're doing a share crop, are you seeing a change from your guys on anybody altering that structure at all on with the increased costs that are coming in for the producer?
I hear some of them. I don't have privilege to all the exacts on some of those. I know recently on some ground that we've rented, there's some new, the seeds becoming an aspect, and the percentage of that a landowner's paying, number one is not all landowners are involved in that. And there's some different of opinion on whether they should or shouldn't be, but there's, I know that's happening, just, through part of the hearsay there. The other, thing we're seeing too, we see some 80%, 20%, where there's not as much expense paid, but there's that's the dues for, having the ability to farm the land, and so there's less expense in that. And actually seen a few on some productivity side, irrigation side, where we actually saw an increase on the landlord side that was actually up 30%. That's pretty rare, but we've seen that come up a few times. So,
I guess that's the thing too. When you're structuring those leases, the details are becoming a little bit more a big deal for landlords as they're starting to be asked to pick up some of these expenses that traditionally they haven't picked up.
That's exactly right, especially with developments in technology and increased seed costs. Different inputs, different, all the, the soil enhancement type things that people are doing now. Those, the devil is in the details, especially with, today with these type of leases.
Sure. Well, and I think that one of the things that comes up a lot when you see the transition of ownership like, Cary deals with this at the FSA. I deal with it. I know Jarrod at State dealing with planning and all that for folks. But a lot of times, when a farmer that has been taking care of everything on a handshake transfers that to an heir that might be a son that's an attorney that's living in Dallas, or a dentist that's living in Fort Worth or San Antonio, they're not always as comfortable with those handshake arrangements, even though they've been probably in many times to the landlord's favor. So do you guys just kind of want to get a consensus around the table, though? What is y'all's feeling? Do you think it'd be beneficial for the existing farmer, while he's still got control of it, to start to think about buttoning up his rental agreement a little bit more? I mean,
I do, because I think, you'd rather, we're trying to maintain a positive relationship with that, and I think, there's not anything, some of the connotations we get with a lease agreement is that, oh, that's just, we have to pay an attorney to do that. No offense, but really, I mean, it just gets into the details, and it answers some of those questions, and you don't have to say, oh, well, what are we going to do about this here, and then you've got an instrument there that's in front of you that ought to spell out the majority of what you got to deal with. So I would be for that, absolutely.
I'm guessing from the standpoint of FSA, y'all absolutely would not have a problem when people walk in with a written lease.
Right. No.
It makes your job easier.
Absolutely, yeah. There's no question then on who's going to be a party to that contract. So, it would be beneficial. And I can also see it from, the operator and the owners. You kind of know 5 years down the road, 4 years down the road, what to expect, what land you're going to continue to have. So, yeah, I think it'd be definitely a positive on both sides.
And I think the longer we go, I think it makes it more important that there's something in writing, because ownership of farms is getting more spread out to people in Dallas and San Antonio. And when 50 years ago, I think it was more handshake. People were local. So the further we go, I think it's going to be more and more important to have the details in writing.
I appreciate those comments. Cary, I guess we kind of move over to your topic a little more detail around you did a really good job of summarizing it earlier, but do you have any other points that you'd like to make around the farm lease?
Just when y'all were talking about dates, that's real critical for our office. I know from time to time that sign-ups change. There's different times. We know we certify at a certain time. The thing is we would like to have the leases in place as early as possible. New year starts in January, fiscal year starts at the end of October. Typically, wheat goes in the ground in September, and we'd like to have those leases in place prior to that. So that's a big benefit.
Do you see? I would think one of the areas where there's really a big deal about not many being a written leases with the ranching side of it.
Right.
Is that correct? I mean, those guys it's pretty uncommon to see a ranching lease.
Right. We don't see many of those. And now with the addition to the livestock programs in 2014, it's kind of put our office in the unique situation, because typically a 200 or 300 acre farm out in this part of the world is fully based. An owner may cash lease 100 acres of the grass to Seth, and he may share lease the rest of the cotton ground, and so we kind of get into some issues there. Shares have to be sufficient in order to claim your claim share. So every once in a while we see some problems like that with the cash leases, but it's few and far between. So.
Well, I think what we're going to do right quick is take a little break, and then we'll be back in just a few minutes, and we're going to hear from Jarrod and then finish up our discussion about farm leases. All right, we're back. We're going to get right back into this with Jarrod over here as he starts. I think we're going to have a unique opportunity here with Jarrod, because Jarrod's a person that I've known for a long time, but he's coming at his attorney work in kind of a unique perspective, because he actually is still an active ag producer himself. Works on a working farm. What would you tell me? A couple days a week you're on the farm?
A couple days usually in Lubbock at the office.
Right.
the
So,
rest.
so it's neat to get an attorney's perspective that's actually out also on the other side of the table. So we're going to go right into letting Jarrod tell us a little bit. I know that Jarrod and I over the last year or two have had a couple of times where I've had to go to him with issues, real estate issues with clients that had issues because of leases or the lack thereof. So go ahead and kind of let's take off with that.
Okay, and it's been kind of talked about before, and most people kind of know the types of leases: cash lease, crop share. And cash lease is really for those that are risk averse. Both sides, landowner and tenant, both know what's going on, what they can expect, but it doesn't allow for any benefit to the landowner if crops are good, prices are good. And it's it allows both parties to share in the good and bad. So, I don't know, I was going to ask you if you've seen a trend as far as more cash leases or less lately? Or?
Actually, it's been really about the same. I mean, we're 97 to 98% shared lease, so not much change either way.
One thing I was going to point out is there's kind of a new thing that people are trying to do is it's like a hybrid of the two. Basically, and most of the time it's based upon the price for that crop. If it, goes above a certain level, then it kind of flexes to benefit the landowner, and vice versa. So that's another option. Now, I'm not sure if that would impact you or not.
I don't know.
It'd probably be set up as a cash lease, I guess, and then
Right. And then based on production, the landowner or something would get a little more.
True.
So,
Yeah.
we haven't seen any of those.
Okay. That's kind of something that may be coming along. But
Creativity can make your job fun.
I hope we haven't seen any of those.
Yeah, it's interesting though.
No.
And with that, anytime you make a contract, lease agreement more complicated, it allows attorneys to get involved or people to disagree on certain things, and can open up a can of worms, I guess. But some of the common pitfalls, I was going to talk about that. Some of the mistakes that people make, landowners and tenants. One is they don't get it in writing. It's a handshake deal.
Yeah.
It's been going on for 10, 15 years. Everybody knows, and it's great until somebody passes away, either the tenant or the landowner, and then, that familiarity and the rules that they've set and been accustomed to people don't know them anymore.
Yeah.
Second is, kind of something that we dealt with recently was you've got to read your lease.
Right.
If it's presented by the landowner or the tenant, the other party needs to read it and be familiar with what it says. What Monty and I dealt with was a right of first refusal that was in a lease agreement that the landowner was not familiar or wasn't aware of. So it created some issues that we had to work out.
Right. Well, and to your point, I think a lot of times, and Seth mentioned this earlier, but there's this tendency to not want to get involved, let an attorney get involved. But at the same time, when you're off in the weeds and you don't really know what you're doing, there's probably not a better time to seek counsel.
Exactly.
To avoid problems down the way, I would think.
That's right. And, realistically, reviewing a lease by an attorney, wouldn't cost more than a couple $100.
Right.
It shouldn't. So, when you look at that cost relative to what might happen,
Mm-hmm.
it's a good investment. The other thing is if it's a multi-year lease, I would recommend the tenant or landowner or both file the lease in the county deed records, just so people are aware that there is a lease. Title companies that review the title upon a sale, they know there's a lease. That's if you don't want to file the lease, if the terms are somewhat, if you want to keep them somewhat confidential, you can file a memorandum of lease. You don't have to put all the terms of record, just who the tenant, landowner are, description of the property, and how long it lasts. So that's a good option.
That's a really good point too, because a lot of times when we get into heirs selling property and they're not familiar exactly with what's going on, or they may think they can sell it not understanding the common law of when they can, sell it.
That's right.
So that's a really good idea.
And as we've said before, the details are important. I guess, FSA payments, typically cash lease, they're distributed according to what the crop share is.
Right.
Crop share
Uh-huh.
releases, and then cash lease, usually the tenant receives all the FSC
100%.
benefits. But, I guess that can be varied according to what the lease
Agree
agreement
to.
says,
Right.
whatever the parties agree to. eminent domain, condemnation, if, what happens to the tenant if the landowner agrees to grant an easement across the property, across the cotton field, that probably needs to be spelled out as far as who gets the damages, surface damage, those kind of payments from the pipeline company, or with all the wind turbines coming
Right,
up. It's becoming really more important.
They're doing a lot of expansion also with the transmission lines.
Lines,
So,
that's right.
those coming through are eminent domain issues for sure. So, and I think value in that at a lot of times talking about attorneys, but also getting appraisers sometimes involved when you're trying to make a decision on, what is this worth? What am I giving up? One other thing that I wanted to ask you about in regards to that, when you're talking about people coming in, sitting down to do a lease, when would you say is the best time of the year if you're a landowner and you're going to start thinking about changing a lease or maybe writing a lease for the first time? Or, and I might ask each one of you guys to weigh in on that, but if a landowner's listening to this today and says, when should I start the process of making a change on my lease?
I would say as soon as possible.
Right.
It's never too late.
Right.
I would always, if it's not in writing, even if the crop's already in the ground, maybe get it in writing, and hopefully the other party will agree to it and understand the situation. But probably before harvest of the previous year's crop, it would be important to actually work on getting a lease ready.
And if somebody did that, as long as they didn't make any big changes, it would be at a point where they need to be talking to their attorney that's helping them, and also making sure that they're checking with the FSA office and also consulting with their crop insurance agent.
Absolutely. A share change is not a huge thing, as long as you're not creating an entity or you're all of a sudden going to have a crop share at a given time. That can be from a crop insurance standpoint at least. Can be you can find yourself without some coverage. So soon is great. But yeah, carrying that in the crop year and starting that at the initial point of the crop year is the best time to have them done at that point, and that way everybody knows if you need a new policy or some things may be changing there, then everybody's aware and things run smoothly.
Okay. Would you echo those things?
Same thing, as soon as possible. If you're thinking it, you probably already need to have that in the works.
That's a good answer.
Especially not for the current year, but
Right.
have it in mind for the next year.
Well, and I think what we find most of the time is when people sit down, both sides like knowing what's expected. It's not that I think there's a fear almost because you don't want to change the way you're doing it, but I think we all agree that each one of us in this room, and we probably could have an accountant sitting here too, saying that these folks need to all work together with the landowner or the farmer to make sure that none of us fall in any of these holes that could happen when you start making these changes. So, Jarrod, when you're working with somebody on a lease, is there a questionnaire? Do you have some type of process where you kind of go through some questions with them to kind of help them? Or
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a written questionnaire, but there's kind of a checklist of things you need as an attorney to get that lease drafted. So.
Well, one of the things that I think I would stress in the side of it, coming at it from the real estate broker side, is, find an attorney that understands farming. And that's why I wanted to have you here today, because I know you've got a really good all around understanding of what goes on the farm. And it's just like with real estate agents, insurance agents, attorneys. I think that it's important to seek out a person that's got some expertise in the field that you're working in. So I guess before we head out here, are there any other points that any of you guys can think about while we're here at the table around the leases and any other things that you could mention that before we head out?
I think we mentioned just briefly grazing leases. I think that's important to get in writing also. And then with the hunting rights are becoming much more important, and that needs to be in writing, especially for the landowner. As far as liability is concerned, there needs to be a liability waiver and acknowledgement of risk, those kind of things that would definitely benefit the landowner.
I think that's something that we haven't really had to deal with as much here until the last couple of 3 years probably, where people are really starting to get some significant revenue off of their hunting. So are you seeing, Seth, I know you primarily farm cotton, but are you seeing a difference? This was one question I wanted to ask. Are you still seeing some different lease arrangements for different crops?
That's kind of gone by the wayside.
That's what I thought.
There's a few that for grain sorghum that used to be structured a little bit differently, and that got further more complex. Whether that was a first crop, whether that was a second crop, and it's finally now gotten to the point where we're seeing a lot of the 75-25 on those crops. Just pretty much across the board. Maybe some caveats on some other crops we don't handle here primarily, but that's primarily what we're seeing. That's kind of passed on. So.
Well, an interesting point that I wanted to make too earlier when you were talking about the cash leases here, that we don't see many straight cash leases where it's 100% to the tenant, but when we start dealing with buyers coming in from the Midwest, it's just the opposite.
Right.
You could flip it on its head, I would say, where they come in and that's what they're accustomed to, and they have a hard time understanding why we do so much sharecrop, but I think it has to do with the risks that are associated with farming in this part of the world. So.
And another thing that we see a lot in our office talking on cash leases is the price difference. Yes. You talk about those guys coming from the Midwest definitely. Where it's huge acres and they get 30-40 inches of rain a year. So yes. we see a lot of discrepancies from folks coming in the Midwest on those cash leases.
And I think that brings up a point too. I know, I've looked and it's amazing. You can take a 7-mile radius in any of these counties around here, kind of search who owns the land, and find 25, sometimes 25 states, where landowners, you can trace them out to different areas. So I think especially if you're a landowner that owns land and you're from a different region, like the Midwest, and you're trying to understand what needs to be done with a lease or a rental agreement here, more important than any time probably to consult with experts in the area, And so I really think that you guys have helped today a lot with this. I think this might be a topic that, if anybody is listening to this on YouTube or on Facebook and they want to submit some questions, we might come back to this at some point. I hope that I can get each one of you guys to agree to come back. You've really helped us out on this first roundtable discussion, and we hope to have many more of these. So one more time before we head out, I'd like to thank Seth Sowder from Lance Insurance, Cary Hanlin from Lamb County FSA, and Jarrod Busby from your law practice. Jarrod, give us your full law practice's name. I don't want to botch that up.
My official firm name is called Ward, Freels and Busby. Essentially, I took over for 2 attorneys that retired, so basically an estate planning probate practice, and so I kind of inherited their files and kind of kept their practice going. They're of counsel, meaning I can consult with them if I need to, but I'm essentially a sole practitioner on my own.
Okay. Well, we appreciate y'all coming, and we'll have these guys' names and stuff posted with the video. We thank them for being on here, and if we can, any of us in our professional realms can help any of you guys out there that thought some of these issues were important, I think anybody at the table would be more than willing and eager to try to help landowners and farmers that need help on that. So, thank you guys.